You just told me that you have been invisible for a long time.
Almost a
So
year.
yeah, so tell me why.
So I've been invisible the last year. I've been working on the fundamental science for the application of trauma, mental illness, those sort of directions. So we now have a new fundamental understanding of the brain. And as I said before, it's coming out of how we look at perceptual science, yeah, from vision, from auditory perception, and it's coming out of experimental psychology and um, psychiatry, and there's information coming out of psychotherapy as well. All points to this type of brain we have that is so important to understand because it now explains why some people get trauma and others don't get trauma. It explains the exact, precise activities that cause trauma. And with that understanding, it also helps us understand there's a natural activity that updates the brain, updates memories, updates reactions to memories, updates our behavior, our body state, our somatics, updates emotions. That activity we can now access through therapy. Yeah, we understand the set of steps to basically access this brain that we have that we now understand from a fundamental point of view. So like my reason being so quiet for this last year is piecing that whole thing together, but doing it in a way now that we want to share with therapists. We want to share with the people that work in trauma, work in helping other people to be better and recover, so that we can start to move towards this fundamental science of the brain and of symptoms, rather than think of symptoms, but think of root causes, right? And rather than work treating symptoms, but work of root causes. And rather than think of this technique, that technique, that technique, think of there's a way the brain works, there's an activity that it has that updates. So how does that technique access that activity and how does it create the update? And once we start thinking in those terms, we're all working together and helping and supporting each other to move forward. How do we use those techniques to use this brain and this brain activity to make the change that transforms trauma for people? So what has come out of this last year is this idea of trauma zero, an idea where the fundamental science suggests we should be able to permanently eliminate a person's trauma symptoms. Yeah, that's what the fundamental science says. And there are people doing things like yourself that can do that sort of thing on many occasions, right? And my role now, what I feel is really important to do is to take that to the world in a way that we can provide that to therapists, this fundamental science understanding that comes from all these disciplines across vision and auditory senses and movement and as I said, psychiatry, psychology is all coming up to this same brain. It's all converging in the same areas. If we can take that to therapists can understand now how their techniques work, why it works, when it doesn't work, why they're getting resistance, why people are stuck based on these brain activities. And from there, refine their techniques, use that information to improve the art. So there's the science and the art. And people like yourself have the art, yeah, and pieces of the science. So what we want to do is bring those together so that all of us as a collective community can support each other. So the art can now feed back and help the science understand those pieces as well. So that's why I've been so quiet, but what's emerging now and what we're looking to take in to share with people who work with trauma and people who work in this space.
Does that mean that science now get interested in what we're doing?
Oh, I think it's always been interested, right? Anytime you can make a difference. But I think there's a split, right? And we're in a world now where the one way to think about it is that a lot of the ways we think about the brain, we think about behavior, we think about medical illnesses, comes from ancient times, comes from thousands of years ago, right? And even the modern era, with coming to Freud and even people, with schema therapy and all these understandings of the brain and attachment theory, all these different theories, all based, there's at the core, there's still kind of caught up in some ways in this past way of thinking about the brain, past way of thinking about behavior that we've done from observation, right? And this is the idea of the triune brain and the way it works to create thoughts, emotions, and instincts. But now, the last 20 years, we've had brain scanners that can look inside and look at the activity of the brain. And now we have a completely different picture of what's happening because we can see the actual activity as it happens. And the scientists have mapped the brain, right? And they see like Google map of roads and see which direction information flows. And they can see the way that our perception is updated by our expectations, not just sensory information, right? So there's a whole lot of concepts now around this new brain, this new understanding of the brain that totally transform how we think about techniques like yours, how we think about illness, how we think about symptoms, and allow us to move to a root cause. So I think there's a split, right? And there's a necessary time period for updating where we go from looking at the brain as it does thoughts, it does emotions, it does instinct, to actually what we know now from the fundamental science that the brain makes predictions and expectations about what you're going to see, about what you're going to feel, and about what you're going to do. And those, when they're based on the past and high expectation, that's when you have trauma, right? Based on that activity. And we know the exact activity that if you dial it up and dial it down, you heal trauma, right? When you dial it down, you heal trauma. When that's high in a person, that activity, that expectation drives how they feel, it drives their response. That's when you have trauma, and that's when you're fighting against this. So I think yeah, you're right. There has been perhaps dismissal of certain techniques or ideas because of this misunderstanding of what's actually going on. And so now what I see is this period of integration, and my colleague Philip Lowe calls it Psych 1, Psych 2, and Psych 3. So Psych 1 is like the old time, where it's just these experts, right? Freud and these big charismatic personalities with their theories of how it all works. Psych 2 is when you start to get the science come in, right? You get this science and how does it work scientifically? But that's been colored by this ancient version of a brain, and our understanding has been layered onto this ancient version of the brain. So we've been stuck in that era. But Psych 3 is no, now we've got the activity of the brain. Because we've got the activity, we can measure inside the brain this whole new way of understanding. We're not stuck in the ancient anymore. We're now open in the modern era. We can understand this brain as this expecting prediction machine, expecting what we see, expecting what we hear. And when that's high enough expectation, it drives your responses. So it's not just the sensory coming in now. We understand how, from these brain maps and activity, the scientists have mapped the brain activity and seen how the expectations go into the perceptual areas at the, in your visual cortex, in your motor cortex, in your interoceptive, right? The insula, in those areas of the brain, they've seen how the expectations update your body state, update your behavior and your movement. So yeah, there might have been this era where it was hard to understand treatments like yours, but in this new era of the brain activity and this understanding of how it maps together, it becomes so much clearer. So yeah, we can unpack those concepts to make sense of techniques like yours, right? It all makes sense. And the outcomes that you get, right, Lilian, like these really permanent and really drastic improvement of symptoms all make sense in this brain activity, this active brain understanding of, thoughts, behaviors, and emotions, a new way of looking at it, body state. So
Well, that's amazing. So science is catching up. I mean, I often have a, can you call it analogy that what science is doing, it's like with our mobile phones that you can use it without how it's made, how the CPU are connected with the different ways. So it's like science is trying to find out how not the phone, but the brain is working, but the rest of us, we can just use it without this knowledge.
Absolutely. And people like yourself have used to help make the change, right? And now what we're seeing coming out of, like, there's thousands of scientists working across the world, all converging on this same understanding of the brain. Everywhere they look, this understanding of the brain makes so much sense of symptoms and our behaviors and our body state. And so it makes sense of why techniques like yours work, for example, Lilian. So yeah, you're right. There's now an understanding of the phone that what I've been doing is how do we simplify this to give it to therapists in a way they can understand it. So then they can go, oh, okay, well, that's why this person healed and this person didn't heal. And if I just do this, this person will also heal. So that's, and that's why, I've seen certain fields where they're dubious of other techniques. And for good reason, right? If you don't understand how they work, you might dismiss them, or ones that say they can heal trauma very quickly, right? And these can often be dismissed by other fields where you work in a more slow, methodical way. Both are equally valid, right? But with this new understanding of the brain, we now begin to understand why these techniques, some can heal trauma in a few hours, right? Caveat, depending on which type of trauma, in which type of person and what type of background they've had, that becomes possible. Yeah, I'm not saying it's possible in all cases with all techniques, but there's certain techniques that can do that. So it starts to become apparent why. Once you understand the activity of the brain, you can now almost anticipate which techniques are going to work well and work to give permanent reduction of the trauma symptoms and elimination of trauma symptoms, and which will struggle and take longer. And so you can start to anticipate now which ones will work and which ones won't be as effective.
Yeah. So how is right now the world is sort of divided in this viewpoint that you have mental diseases and physical diseases.
Yeah.
And that's, the field I have been digging into with the physical diseases like Parkinson and sclerosis and similar. So how is the physical field of doctors and science going into that?
That's a really good question, Lilian. I think it's a really good question, and that's a really there's a lot of connections there. I think it's impossible to unpack them all right now, but I think there's a book, Andy Clark, The Experience Machine, where he talks about this new brain, this understanding of this brain, and as making predictions that affect our perception and our body state and our behavior. And in there, he starts to now talk about those links. Yeah, talk about how
Okay.
physical symptoms
Yeah.
arise from the action of these activities in the brain. One area that might be interesting, you might have already come across, is treating pain, chronic pain, as a prediction. So this is that, where you're getting into physical symptoms, right? Pain is a physical symptom. And what they see, so obviously, a lot of this comes about because we can look inside the brain. And when they looked inside the brain of people with chronic pain, what they saw was the activity wasn't the pain centers lighting up, more it was these anticipation, expectation, prediction centers lighting up. And so they kind of, based on this whole new understanding of the brain, they said, well, if that's the case, if this chronic pain is an anticipation or prediction of the perception of pain, so pain becomes a perception now rather than an absolute experience, right? It's perception, as in all the things we perceive. What if we treated it as a prediction? What would happen? And
I mean, that's what I do. I treat it exactly that way, that, yeah, these people have been put in the box with physical symptoms, but I treat them exactly as you are telling about, helping them with the trauma in the life. I can give away the tip that war veteran was okay before the war and broken after the war, so he can pinpoint exactly what caused the change in him. But a person with Parkinson, they have a long life of smaller things going on, so it's not the thing, it's probably a lot of smaller things going on that when they get older pile up and push them to having symptoms.
And that makes a lot of sense. So yeah, if you kind of now understand that, so these people suffering from pain perception, once they treat it with prediction, the results were that pretty much most of them recovered. Yeah, compared to standard treatments where most of them still after a year or so, or after the treatment period, are still suffering in pain, and that continues for a year. Whereas the ones they treat as prediction, most of them recovered, and a year later was still recovered. So that kind of points the way to these permanent type cures. Once you update the prediction, you're actually changing the downstream, right? And this is where it links up with what you're saying. You're saying downstream is the physical symptoms, right? So somewhere there must be a cause of these physical symptoms. And what we're seeing now with the brain activity is now we're getting to root cause, right? And as you say, and I think you spoke about the metaphor last time, the wobbly tire over time, right? And those sort of metaphors where you can understand how this small cause starts and becomes a bigger physical symptom later. So, from the pain perception, people want to look at that up. Howard Sjøberg is the guy who's leading this new understanding of treatment for pain. And there's Mick Thackeray, who is understanding pain as perception. So I think Mick's got a TED talk on pain perception. Howard Sjøberg has got a movie out. I think something like this is going. And did that pause for a little while there?
Yeah, we had a pause.
Howard Sjøberg's got a movie out. Mick Thackeray's done a TED talk. So, and these are on the science literature as well. So if you want to look at that pain study, that's in the literature. So now they're understanding pain, chronic pain, as a perception and treating as a prediction, these expectations in this type of brain activity. What you're talking about is it goes a little bit beyond that, right? And so you've got to start to draw some lines between the dots. And that's where it becomes a little bit blurrier. But the dots are getting more clear. So the dots that connect our past experiences, sort of, if you think of this brain activity, you've got the past, and the past is used to generate your responses now, right? Your body state, your behavior, even how you see the world, right? So those then can start to drive, if the expectations are a certain way, you start to now expect a certain world, and you expect a certain of yourself. Those can start to drive the body in a certain, like that wobbly tire, off its normal homeostasis, off its normal well-being. And once it deviates from that, I think we spoke last time, Lilian, about allostatic load. Do you remember that word, allostatic load? So that's where these impacts over the long term start to cause expense in the body and in well-being. So it's not one of the reasons why we're starting with trauma is because trauma is a very clear line, right? There's things happen in your past, and we can actually update that. And then downstream, even from that, is where you're working, right? It's like the physical symptoms of that. So, there is if you look at them as downstream, which they are from this brain activity, by treating them upstream here in their root cause, you would expect some change, but that's going to take a little bit of time, especially if there's allostatic load for the whole body to start to heal again, not just the update, but actually the physical body as well. So there's a few more pieces involved.
So now I'm having a provoking question, maybe not for you, but so like I think psychotherapists start healing traumas already in the 70s or maybe before with Freud and all that. So should people with physical diseases understand that science is maybe 50 years behind and the psychotherapists are in the front line here and sort of relax and just go with the flow and trust that you can heal and say, yeah, science will come, but if you need to trust science, you have to wait for some decades before they catch up.
I think you're right. There's always a lag, right? There's always a lag between, there's people who understand things ahead of time. And then there's a lag between even when science understands it and becomes adopted as the common understanding. And I think there's a massive, I think what you're talking about, there's a massive misunderstanding based on the past of how the brain works, how the body works, right? And that's being radically updated in a massive paradigm shift of this new understanding of brain activity and the predictions and so on. And so I think you're right. I think there's going to be a delayed period from that. What we see is, so my colleague was talking about Psych 1.0, Psych 2.0, Psych 3.0. And so we're in the year of Psych 3.0 now, right? We understand this brain. We have all the science evidence has stacked up so firmly across all the senses, across action, across your body state, across emotion. When they look at emotion, for example, Lisa Feldman Barrett, she uses these brain activities and prediction to explain emotions, right? So the modern understanding of emotion is actually based on these brain activities. And Neil Seth looking at consciousness, right? Again, all based on these brain activities. So our modern understanding in science is of that. But there's also a delay in science catching up with science, right? So when we talk about Psych 3.0, the evidence is there and the science is very clear, which is one of the reasons why we want to share that with the people that need to know about it, trauma therapists, and then onwards from there. But that's Psych 3.0, right? Which is the connection of the brain creating these issues. I think what you're talking now is perhaps medicine Psych 4.0, where we actually see those physical symptoms and the psychological, and that whole connection becomes much clearer. And this is one of the reasons why I want to share this, because when we share this basic science, which now is well understood foundationally, right? And that provides a foundational understanding across disciplines, right? This is physiology, psychology, psychiatry, biology, artificial intelligence, all have this understanding of the brain, right? And how it works. So there's a lot of the science is caught up to that. But the next step, which is the one you're talking about, I see is going to take a little delay while we see those effects filter into the world. So the work you're doing, I think, makes sense through the lens of this new brain. It makes absolute sense. And then I think what you're providing is that leading edge of what I said, the science and the art, that becomes feedback to become medicine psychology 4.0, right? Where things start to make sense from this understanding of the brain and the body together and how it works. So yeah, I think you're right. There's a trust, there's different delays, right? But what I would say now, we're clearly in the Psych 3.0 era, which is a new understanding of the brain, a new understanding of trauma, and that's pointing the direction to this new understanding of physical symptoms as well, right? Starting with pain as one of those, but not just pain. There's other sort of physical type things treated through this prediction element. And you're obviously working in the furthest down. Number 4, right? Which takes time for that sort of leading edge to kind of make fuller sense of. But it's moving in that direction. And when you think in terms of the brain activity, you can look at, say, for example, the techniques you use and see how it makes sense in terms of brain activity, updating the things that do the activity that, as I said, that activity is whether it causes trauma or doesn't cause trauma, right? The same event can happen to a different person. Some people will end up traumatized, some won't. So these brain activities make it really clear who will end up and why and how that happens, and also how using their own brain activity to update that. But yeah, you're kind of leading in that out there in the 4.0, I think, Lilian, which is
thank you for
exciting
saying
area to
that.
be, right?
I think you can tell the guys that pain is just one symptom. I'm pretty sure that whatever they find out, how the circuits are built in regards to that, it's the same regardless of what symptom you can push forward. So pain is just a symptom all people can agree upon, but it's probably it comes with a big package of knowledge, because we are meant to we are in the way that if you don't get if you are in a, let's say, car crash as a teenager, and you are treated immediately, there's a bigger likelihood that you are in a next car crash, but it's because it's a way of learning. It's how it's meant to be, that we should learn from these things, never go there again. If there was a lion in a cage and you went in there and nearly got eaten, you have learned never go there. That's why it's installed in us. It's the fastest way to stay out of trouble, because you build on top of old situations. So it
When you
comes
talk
with
about it,
some knowledge what's going on here.
yeah, yeah. Now, I get what you're saying, right? We need to learn. Yeah, there's an important learning system. When that learning system, 20 years on, is still trying to stop you getting abused or whatever else happened in your past, but that's less likely to happen now,
Yeah.
then it's not effective.
No.
Yeah, that's when it's trauma.
Yeah.
Right? If it stops you going into a lion's cage, it's not trauma, right? When it's still happening 20 years on and affecting your life and affecting your mental health and affecting your bodily state and your health, your well-being, your sleep and your nervous system regulation, when it's affecting those 20 years on, that's trauma, right?
Yeah.
We need to treat that now or when it happens. So that's why, to me, it's so important we share this science, right?
Yeah.
Collectively. Because the more of us that are working in this way, like you, the more of us doing that, the more trauma is going to be healed, and the more we move towards this trauma zero as a population, not just
Yeah.
individual, but populations. So that's where I see the two parts, the science and the art. And we bring those two together, right? Work together collectively. Now we can start to bring, like, trauma has just increased and increased over generations. We can start to turn that back and bring that down. And that's why we want to bring this out and share this. It's the science of effective treatments for
And
trauma.
that's if you talked about the fastest way to do it, is to find some influencers that have a hook in a lot of people, because scientists is not very good at sharing things and social media. So we need some guys that have thousands and thousands of followers to spread this knowledge. Science cannot, they are not good at that. So that's number one. And when it's out, it's to start to reformat the school system and have health, both mental and physical health, in the school. So every week, children have 2 hours of health. So that's how to implement it the fastest. So they start to understand it in whatever fits the age group. And it is coming out. I see a lot of posts about that, but it's coming from can you say, the roots? And there's a huge part of the population, maybe 80%, that still have doctors and science as gods. So they won't trust anything before it comes from doctors. But there's a lot of things happening.
That's one of the reasons why I'm actually really excited what's happening with people like Howard Schubiner, for example, and Mick Thackeray, that are transforming how people think about pain, right? And that's where the doctors will start to hear about this. They'll start to get a new picture. And for us working with Trauma Zero, so I've partnered with a psychologist Philip Lowe, and together we're doing this. And what we'd like to do is track this, obviously, trauma workers, mental health workers, people working in trauma, primarily psychologists, right? Because people trust their psychologists. Psychologists are well trained to use this type of approach. And especially psychologists working with trauma and psychologists working with complex trauma. This can make that difference to making sure that their interventions are more consistently effective, right? So we see it as important to bring out to those doctors, to those psychologists, to those areas, right? So yeah, there's the grassroots finding out about it, and driving sort of a demand for it. But we also see taking it directly to those people, those authorities that can make the difference, where this science actually supports them in their work, helps them to achieve the results they want to achieve, and get the outcomes they want for their clients. And that's where we're targeting this. So, we'll be looking at academic courses for psychologists. So when they're coming through in the early stages, and for those who haven't, are already trained, providing training to them as well. So, as well as providing, we want to put this science as an open source out for people like yourself to share, and for the concepts underlying this science and why people get stuck in trauma, why people get stuck in these symptoms, providing that as open source, so it's freely available and freely accessible to be shared. So that's the activities we want to do to share with the world, because I don't think we can wait 5 to 10 years, right, for this to become knowledge and used in the world. Like when I read some of those trauma studies on people who've had that trauma for 20 years, and the end of the treatment still had the trauma, right, in a so-called successful treatment, and they still were traumatized and depressed, and still hospitalized with all sorts of conditions. So yeah, it's for us, it's critically important that we do this collectively and share this. So that's why we want to open source the knowledge and the science so that it can be shared, and try and bring this fundamental foundational science, this fundamental scientists and the psychologists and those professionals and medics that need to know about it, and bring those together, those communities together.
Interesting thing, and that was that you could, did you say, use the word predict how one person got the trauma and the other didn't get the trauma? I think you should elaborate a little.
Yeah, from a similar event happening to 2 different people, you can get an understanding why some might, and why some might heal as well. So
what have you found out? I have a pretty good understanding, but please tell yours.
Well, I base mine all on the foundational science, right? The brain activity. So from the point of view brain activity, you've got these 7 activities, and one of those is kind of how confident or reliable the brain feels this information is to hold on to, right? To predict our future, to keep us safe in the future. So that piece of information you almost think of as the trauma maker, right? That activity is a trauma maker, because if that's high, then it's very hard to change that belief or change that learning, right? Because the high confidence, it's like a confirmation bias, right? That high confidence, and actually confirmation bias comes from this activity anyway. But yeah, it's that high confidence will prevent you from updating, make it very hard to update that activity, you update that learning, right? If the confidence or reliability in the information is low, you can now update any learning, any beliefs, any schema that then are used to reassembled by the brain to give you your response in the present, and your perception of the world and perception of yourself, right? So that activity you can think of as the trauma maker, that the confidence or reliability of the information, the way the brain holds that. Now that's going to depend on their past experiences, right? So I'll give you an example. So I was an EMDR trainer talked to me about a client he had that had been viciously assaulted. And so from that, he was trapped in his house, scared to go out. He, even to take the rubbish bin out, he would have to turn all the lights, if it was at night, all the lights, check, be really anxious, kind of run out, drop the bin, run back to get back to safety, right? So his brain was still using the past to predict what's happening now and what I should do about it. Now, within 5 minutes, and there's a, if you're working with single shot trauma like this, like an attack, when I say single shot, it's different to say complex trauma, which is those lots of little T's or even big T's. Like complex trauma is bigger T's. There's the little T's as well. When you're working with these single events, that was pretty much the only negative event that he had mostly in his life, right? Before that was mostly pretty good, and his childhood was pretty good. So it only took a few minutes of treatment for him to start to see the world, for his brain to update that, talk about that confidence, reliability, and that information, to update that so that following those 5 minutes, he never had a problem again putting the rubbish out or going out, right? He was, what you say, healed, right? Whereas someone who has had more little t trauma, big T trauma, their brain actually has an understanding already the world is dangerous. Their self isn't able to keep them safe. They can't trust other people, right? So that's already built into the system. So that's already a reliable bit of information. So it's anything else adds to that and confirms that, right? And so they're very likely then to be holding on, not consciously holding on, but harder to update. So you actually need to come into this learning to update those events, right? So that's where you need to now access this deeper learning, but you're still doing the same way through these brain activities. So you start to understand now how this trauma maker activity, the confidence or reliable one, holds on to learning or lets it go. Yeah. And whether that then the past still happens in the present and determines how you respond, or whether you're actually healed and now you're able to flourish, right? And that's what we see. That's what we see is when you start to use these brain activities, you can now come in and access, because there's this reliability. It's almost a gate, right? If you try and make change and it's slammed shut as a therapist, a person slammed, like you hear the sound of that gate slamming shut, like I'm not making this change. There's something in here that's not consistent with the change or provides a threat. And the brain anticipates all of that information in this and you understanding the activities. And so it'll decide whether it'll update or not based on that. So you start to now get a bit of a picture, right? I haven't unpacked all the concepts here. You start to get a bit of a picture from that, how now, how effective a technique is now depends on how you can access this trauma maker activity, right? How you can start to bring that down so you can access that learning and update it. So the brain has a natural activity to update it. So how you access that is what matters through these different techniques. So that's the kind of information. If once we get this understanding of the brain, then it makes sense why some techniques work and some techniques work to get this reliability indicator and hold on to the information learning down, and some don't do that. But you can modify them, you can tweak them to do it, right? Once you understand what you're playing with, this type of brain that generates and expects our world and ourself and our perception of our body state and our interoceptive experience and proprioceptive, our behaviors. So I haven't unpacked, there's a few concepts to unpack for that all to make more sense, which is why we need to open source, why we're open sourcing this information. So if you do want to know more about it, we're looking to open source that so you can access all the concepts to make sense of that.
If I should tell it with my, what can we call it, daily practice with my client, I would say that the two different people you're talking about, the one is living in a healthy, caring, loving family, and the other is living in a family where there's not much support either from busy parents or from stressed parents that are using hard tone of talking, and the one good family has a lot of, I call it, supporting belief around the world. Everything is going to be okay. We support each other in hard situations, and the other has no one, or even bad one, that's your fault, things are going the wrong direction, for example. And then if these two meet, a robbery or an attack of something, then the one can easier bounce back because he has a foundation in his family. There's one more thing. If there's a caring family member next to them when it happens, that can
Right.
give
That would
them
make sense.
comfort, then it
Yeah.
never become a trauma because
Yeah.
they can cry, they can get a hug, they can talk about the situation. But the guy that are alone with nobody to talk to for a long time, or that doesn't dare to talk about it because it's embarrassing, or
Yes.
fear for reactions, they have a much larger risk of storing these traumas.
Yeah.
So that's
Yeah. Yeah.
the daily day.
Day-to-day version. Yeah. Right. And that's so important because it's effectively in the end, it's the meaning the brain makes of it, but it's the meaning in terms of the reactions and the body responses that really matter. And as you said, those meanings can be effective. If you've got someone there comforting you, it can mean, oh, actually, I'm okay. Right. And you know, I might have been attacked, but I'm okay. Whereas the other guy who never had that support, then the meaning might still be, oh, that confirms my view of the world. And so, you know, this learning that he has is being supported. So yeah, yeah, I think you've described it really nicely, that's the sort of
And you can say that's, if I should say only one sentence about how therapists work, is that they open to that experience with whatever it contains of emotions and thoughts and beliefs, and recreate the situation as if there was somebody next to them.
right.
So you heal it, and
Yeah,
for some funny reason the brain cannot tell the difference between the old factual memory and the one we create.
it's Lilian. It's nice because you use the word "it's some funny reason," right? It's almost like there was no understanding of that. But actually, when you think in terms of brain activities, you understand memory being very different to how we think about memory at the moment. Memory is actually the sensory component. Yeah, and it's not just what you saw, those sensory components, what you heard, but it's actually the sensory components of what's the reaction in my body. Yeah, and
What
what
did I
became,
have in my mouth? Were I eating while then
right?
it's the taste or the
Taste. Yep.
components of whatever you ate, the sensation on where did the rubber grab you in
Right.
on the arm, the
Exactly.
weather, the humidity, where was
Right.
the sun. So I've
Yeah.
tried several times in my life that suddenly you go a place and you say, I've been here before, or this remind me of this and this situation, and you get
Yeah.
an instant flash on there's something here. I've put I call it a bookmark in myself
Yeah.
that has recorded all the things that are valid for this place, for example.
Exactly. And that's the key to this new brain, this active brain, right? So when we think about memory, it's got this storehouse of all your experiences as sensory experiences. And what it does is reassemble them for your current context, right? And if that expectation of what's happening is strong enough, right? I talked about that confidence activity, that then generates your body state and that memory, right? It breaks through
Yeah,
your conscious, yeah, and it generates your bodily state connected to that,
yeah.
right? And that's all stored in your memory system and the activity system. So this new understanding of the brain makes sense of that type of experience, right? So, right, like we don't have to kind of think like for some funny reason we don't understand why. It's like, well, no, the brain has this storehouse of sensory experiences that is reassembling. And if it believes in the current context that that is reliable information to use now, then it'll reassemble that information. And anything related to that will start to come into memory systems and states. So yeah, when I start to look at memory as different, right? There's this current understanding that the brain has to turn it into an episodic memory. And in some way that is true, because when it is episodic, it doesn't have procedural type, what action do I need to do? What state do I need to be in, right? But to get it to episodic, that's where you need to deal with these reactions to the memory, which are stored again in this system and generated out, depending on whether it's, like you would use sensory information and connection to the body to help someone access that sort of state, right? What you're actually doing is getting to reassemble the past right now, right? Because that's what this predicting brain does. It just assembles stuff right now. And it's kind of timeless, right? This predicting brain is just assembling stuff as the context comes. It's automatically doing that. So our perception is totally biased by this expectation system, and our actions are totally biased within this, right? Based on our past expectations. So yeah, when you talk about updating that memory, like you said beautifully, where you've got someone to help you heal, that's one way to update the reliability of the meaning that was made from that sensory information, right? And which, drives what response you have to that information. So that's one way to do it. And it starts to make sense from the way this brain works. So it's nice, all right? You can start to understand how these different modalities. So I think that's similar. I think in schema, they do these float backs where you start to reinterpret things, which is very similar to what you're talking about. You can start to understand why they work or how they work. And when they don't work, what to do to tweak them to make them work more effectively. And that's what this brain activity is about. So it starts to give us that foundation of understanding.
I have a last question. I have read in a couple of articles that you actually have memory cells in your body. There's been a lot about the gut, but as I can see it, I'm pretty sure that we have memory cells all over the body. Is there any science you have come across that?
It's a good question. It seems like there's some processing in the heart and the guts. But I think you're talking something a little different to that.
No, because that's two organs, but I think they are distributed all over the body, but more densely in the core of our body and in our organs. What do you think about that?
Interesting. I think if that's the case, I think we still access that through the same pathways, right? We use the conscious brain connection to the body, connection to thoughts, emotions, and so on, to get a connection into what's happening in this prediction system, right? And so if that's the case, those are part of the prediction system, right? They are part of anticipating what information do we need to hold on to, because that represents the world we're in and who we are, right? And the type of people and type of other agents like other animals or whatever else that surround us, right? So we need to be prepared for that world. And what they find is that when you're prepared for the world, your reactions are faster, so your survival's increased. With this type of prediction type brain, we can risk-free plan things, right? With this type of brain we can basically run a simulation of what would happen if, right? But actually what ends up happening is our brain runs those simulations in different contexts for us. But you can cognitively do it, right? You can access those. And that's what you're doing when you say, hey, let's go back to that memory. What would happen if, right? And now you start to bring this new information that can bring down the certainty of the meaning from the past. So if there is memory cells, and I don't know, I haven't seen the evidence for that as a distributed system, but if there is, it would just be working exactly the same way. Yeah, it would be using the past to reassemble right now what information is important for us to act, right? So we're already pre-acting, right? We're already preloaded for that world, right? And that's what this brain of ours does.
I have an idea that if you are in a situation and something bad happens,
Yeah.
then the brain is sort of too slow to react. and you are dependent on your instincts. Do you jump away from the car, or do you avoid someone is trying to push you or give you a stroke of something? And so when you interact with your instincts, the brain might be too slow, sort of, and you use some more primitive things to push yourself into action.
Okay, so again, a couple of things there to clear up. So you said the brain is too slow when we go to instincts, right? So kind of falling to that old brain of thoughts, emotions, instincts, right? This is the old triune brain that we kind of put over here, and there's an activity brain, right, that we have in front of us. When we look at that, and the work of Lisa Feldman Barrett shows it really clearly, if you rely on your cognitive system to do what you're saying, that is too slow, right? But there is a prediction system designed specifically for that action, right? And she talks about it. If you sports like baseball, right? You know, baseball,
Yeah.
they couldn't exist if you relied on seeing the ball to hit the ball, right? They rely on this prediction system that anticipates where the ball is going to be. It works out that it anticipates it. And based on practice, right, which is again part of this prediction system, so you preload the activity, right, into this activity system. So the two work together. So the senses and the body state aren't separated, right? Your visual system, your visual processing cortex is actually updated by your brain activity, right? Not just sensory. And your activity is updated by your sensory cortex, right? They're intricately linked. So you're not waiting until you see the ball. The brain doesn't wait to act. When that visual information comes, before it even gets anywhere near conscious awareness, it's already creating action. They're all aligned, right? There's one unity perception across the body and across your actions. So this new understanding of the brain, and as Lisa Feldman Barrett describes, these sports like baseball couldn't exist if the brain didn't act this way, right? It would be too slow. But actually the brain, and you talk about instincts, right? So now let's look at instincts. In this understanding of brain activity, we start to get a new understanding of what instincts are and can be. Yeah.
What you're talking about, it's like a fireman that has had a year-long education in how to go into buildings and be in places where there's a huge risk of trauma, and he's learning how to manage a myriad of different situations. But a trauma, it's a person that's unprepared. That's like putting the guy you talked about, the baseball player, putting him in some sort of field, and he had no clue what sort of game he was in, or which size the ball was, if it was coming through the air, on the ground. He had nothing that could predict that situation. That's where the trauma situation, you're not knowing, okay, in 5 minutes the robber will come and hit me.
Yeah, right. I'll be robbed.
Let me prepare for that situation. Can I have a coach here, and let's train
Right.
that? I do this. It's
Exactly.
called
It's a habit,
karate,
right?
or something. So here in trauma, we are having an unprepared person that haven't 1,000 times rehearsed how to avoid an attack.
They haven't. Yeah, okay. So yeah, absolutely. It makes sense, right? So this is a person unprepared for what's about to happen. They're not expecting it. So it's a surprise. Yeah. It's a negative surprise. So it's important to the brain to remember those negative surprises. Yeah. So this is going to be important to make a memory about this. And yeah, the person hasn't, like a fireman, or hasn't been like a baseball player where they developed their habits, right? And refined and practiced what to do. So their brain in the moment will do the best it can. And it has spent a lifetime working out how to move and how to avoid objects, right? How to fight with a brother or sister and what to do in those situations. So although it hasn't prepared for this precise one, this prediction system has a whole lot of stuff at its disposal that it will try and use, right? And depending whether that guy grabs him or how it turns out, whether those are successful or unsuccessful will determine the meaning made. So the proprioception, right, where I expect my body to be and where I want to be doing, those then go into the meaning of the event, right? So it all becomes part of the trauma. And it's understood now through those pathways, through this brain and how it works, that that stuff makes sense, right? It's all built into this system. And so, and beyond that, the person, like the baseball player, you know, he's done lots of training. What they've seen with the brain after being in a traumatic accident, or even just show people like vivid images, what their brain does automatically is keep replaying those, right? And that could be conscious, or it could be like, it could reach the level of conscious, but it could also be unconscious. And it happens in your sleep and happens when you're in quiet time. The brain automatically replays those and starts to build up its repertoire of what will I do next time? How will I respond next time, right?
You can
So,
say that that's maybe the link, that the trauma is helping the person to rehearse
yeah,
the same
yeah,
situation. So that's where the baseball player come in. So you are
yeah.
rehearsing for
And
what would I do the next time I get robbed. The problem is it's so
that,
rare
yeah,
that it doesn't make
right.
sense to have that.
And yeah, what happens at rehearsal could be conscious, it could be unconscious. And if it's unconscious, it still drives these actions, right? And drives the nervous system state. But yeah, so that then strengthens how the brain responds to this stimuli in the future, right? This weather, you know, in this location, right? So the brain doesn't have that single shot. It actually replays it multiple times. And they've shown it actually replays it at 20 times the speed, right? So it speeds it up. So the brain is actually compressing 4 seconds of action into 20 milliseconds, right? And then what it does is unpack these 4 millisecond events and uses those to go, right, what's going to happen? Bang, 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 bang. Okay, this is the outcome I want. This is the action, right? So the brain is unpacking these 4 millisecond type compressions of 4 seconds of action, right? So it's a really, like, because we can measure brain activity, you can see that in the brain. You can measure it and you can show where it is, where it's happening. And this is what we've never had before. And this is why, you know, it's such an exciting time for us to be psychotherapists or psychologists or psychiatrists or working in mental health or helping people with their health like you are, because we have this new understanding now, right? Because we can look inside the brain and we can see this stuff and we can put it together and understand how it all works together and know, okay, that's how it works. And that there's actual activity, natural activity in the brain that updates this. How do we access through the therapy modalities that we have? How do we get better as therapists doing that? And when we all do that collectively, that's when we bring that trauma collectively down. So yeah, I think it's an exciting time now, you know, with this information, how it's going to change what we do.
And I think I would share an example from my therapy. A woman that didn't like that her sons forgot to close the door to the outside, just being forgetful. And she told that she was afraid that someone should run into the door. And then I tried to make her explain a little more, and she said that this person she imagined would run into the door look a little like not a superhero but a super villain. And then I got the clue that, and I asked the way I do, what was going on, how old were she when this happened. And then she was reminded about her and her siblings watching television, seeing a comic, I don't know, Superman or Batman, probably Batman. And she had this experience of an intruder that was really
Yes.
Bad in this, she was maybe, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 years
Yeah,
old.
really.
So
Really.
even a television program can put you into this trauma. So she,
Oh, yeah.
for 50 years, has been afraid of people running in her door.
Yes.
So the smaller we are, the younger we are, the bigger impact even small things have. So no parents would think it's dangerous to let their children see a cartoon, but it's not the situation, it's the emotion it creates. And let that be a warning to leaving your children seeing anything alone that you don't have control over, because you have no idea what impacts a small child. No idea. So I'm dealing sometimes with things that are insignificant in a grown-up person's eyes. So again, this pile of small things can 60 years later end up in a severe disease we call today Parkinson, but should been labeled, I don't know, PTSD or something like that.
Right. Yeah. No, that's a really good point, Lilian. And yeah, this brain of ours, like one way to think it, the activity that does is sort of up the corridor around the corner, anticipating what's going to happen. And it's doing that based on what's happened in the past, what it believes is really important information to hold on to. And yeah, if that information, it drives the body to be in a stress state or out of homeostatic sort of well-being, those downstream effects can be things like tremors. And just reminded me, I talked about this book a few times, but it really addresses the state of the art of this brain. And he talks about tremors. I don't need to talk about Parkinson's tremors. He's talking about tremors as part of this expectation system, right? So it might be interesting for you. So he talks about and how they, in these type of tremors, when you look at them, they get bigger, right? When you look at them, when you're distracted, they disappear, right? And that type of tremor now, it's like the pain. You can see certain types of chronic pain are attributed to the prediction system. And from Andy Clark's work, and it's prediction, the experience machine, he calls it, the book. He describes now how certain tremors are part of this prediction system, right? So some of these physical ones can be understood now through this activity. So
that's amazing, because that's a small dent into the two spheres of mental and physical.
I think we need to make more smaller and smaller and bigger dents into this sphere. So that's why, to me, it's so critical and important we share this new understanding of the brain that has such a scientific foundation. So it makes
I
difference.
think I've got an answer to all my questions. Do you have a last thing to share with people?
Oh, I think if people like yourself, right? You're kind of working almost this frontier, and it can be isolating, can be challenging, and also any people working, right? Any people working with trauma and any people working in those areas where, either you're not getting the results that you want, not getting as effective as you want, or things are misunderstood. Like, with the doctors, that's where this foundational science makes a difference. So I believe collectively, if we share this science, if we distribute it, and we want to make it open source so that's possible, then we collectively can make more and more dents on this popular understanding of the brain, popular understanding of disease and so on, and trauma symptoms, even mental health, and actually bringing this new brain, this new understanding that allows us to update how we think about mental health, how we think about trauma, how we think about physical symptoms, and the understanding of how this brain works to update that. So we can then think about how do we think about treatments, what makes sense from a treatment point of view, so that collectively we can start to now really address these deeper issues and ongoing things that, you know, the science shows doesn't need to go on. These don't need to become symptoms in the long run, right? These can be treated. So yeah, I think if we work together, we can make that possible.
That sounds good. And it was, as I heard it, a suggestion to share this video, and I can hopefully get a handful of the links you have talked about to the guys that want to see the science behind, they can read about it.
Yes. So we are I've spent the last year putting it together. Our next stage is now putting it onto a website so that people can access it. So as we speak, it's not there, it's not on a website. But in the next few months, we'll be adding the concepts that go behind this brain. We'll be adding all the science links that show, so people can check out the science for themselves. We'll be adding then, you know, how you work with this brain and start to put those pieces together. And then, yeah, looking to kind of work collectively, like how do we improve our art of resolving these physical and emotional and yeah, mental health and trauma symptoms.
Maybe if you don't have it already, you can make a page with where you start collecting the easier accessible articles and the like.
Yes, yeah. Well, yeah, there's thousands. So yeah, but I can point to some of the main books and some of the main pieces.
Sounds good to me.
Yes.
So,
all right, wonderful. So lovely to talk to you, Lilian.
Same, always good. I will stop the recording now.